Imagine a quiet morning, not the kind where birdsong greets sunlight through polished lattice windows or incense coils in the courtyards of clean marble homes. No, this is a different kind of dawn. You're not in the city. You're not even allowed near its gates. You're waking up in the scrubby, dust-strewn margin outside, where the wind carries smoke from the cremation ground, and the earth is gritty with ash. This is not a village in the way others know it. It's a cluster of huts made of dried reeds and warm cloth, patched and low, tethered to the edge of society as firmly as a raft lashed to the bank of a wide, uncrossable river. This is where the Chandalas live. And if you were born here, you would wake up to the smell of yesterday, fires still smoldering in the ground, to the quiet murmurs of your kin already moving, collecting things washing with water drawn from a stream downstream of every other use. The water is never clean, but it's what you have. You use a broken clay pot because whole vessels, you are told, are too good for your touch. The city, even though it's near, might as well be a mirage. You cannot enter the temples. You cannot attend the markets. If your shadow touches the wrong threshold, it might be washed away with cow urine and mantras. But here, among your people, there's a rhythm. Hard, slow, and smoky, but familiar. One person tends to the firewood, another prepares a body for burning, and someone else, perhaps you, walks the familiar path toward the nearest wooded stretch, looking for fuel. The work of a Chandala is not sudden or dramatic. It is not a single moment of action followed by applause or even acknowledgement. It is a long, continuous task of service to the living by tending to the dead. The dead must burn. It is the law. Not a legal one, but a sacred one, etched into the bones of the society that banishes you. You do not cremate the high-born alone. Sometimes, during plagues, you carry entire carts of bodies, those no one else dares to touch. During drought, the corpses come quickly and quietly, wrapped in faded fabric, sometimes half buried in sorrow, sometimes abandoned outright. You receive them with care, because that is your duty. Because even those who curse your name still require your hands. The firewood is not always sufficient. Sometimes it is damp. Sometimes you burn cow dung or old, half-rotted timber. And still the flames must rise. You build the pyres slowly. You arrange the limbs with practiced detachment. You know how long it takes. You know when it is done. And afterward, when the families have left, when the prayers have ended, when the wind is still, you sweep the ashes away. You gather bone fragments into the river, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with weary routine. The work does not shock you. It is the only work you've ever known. Imagine being told that your very presence, your voice, even the sight of you in daylight, could disturb the purity of another's ritual. You walk the path into the woods only after sunrise has turned away. You avoid eye contact with travelers. If you see a Brahmin approaching, you step aside not just off the road, but far off into the scrub or the ditch. If you don't, the consequences might not be immediate violence, but they might be ritual exclusion. A temple might close. A ceremony might be considered tainted. A priest might bathe again and chant new mantras to cleanse what your presence soiled. And yet, what irony when those very same people die. It is you they need. No birth without a priest. No death without a Chandala. You are invisible in life and indispensable in death. Children born into your clan learn this young. Even the youngest ones fetch firewood with care, avoid sacred grounds, and speak in lowered tones if strangers pass. They do not play near roads. They do not touch what has not been discarded. You learn to smile among your own people, to laugh in the privacy of smoke. But beyond this zone, every joy becomes a risk. Every gesture might be taken as defiance. Every step closer to the city might invite punishment, not always legal, but cultural, enforced by looks, words, silence. At the end of a long day, when the bodies have burned and the smoke has thinned into the sky, you return to the village. Not quite a village, really just huts and silence. Your dinner is humble. Sometimes grains left at the edge of a landlord's field. Sometimes spoiled vegetables given by a merchant who will not speak to you directly. The food is placed not in your hands, but on the ground or in broken clay pots that others would never reuse. No one eats with you outside your people. No one drinks from your cup. Even the rain, when it falls, is said to be cleaner than your touch. And yet, you survive. You make music from reeds. You paint on walls. You find love in private courtyards made of bamboo and cloth. You raise children with lullabies that carry the memory of smoke and silence. Not because you are allowed to, but because life insists on blooming even in ash. The Chandala is not merely an unfortunate victim of caste. They are a result of a long history of ritual separation, purity codes, and evolving power. The earliest Vedic texts don't speak of them much. But by the time of the Manusmriti, the word appears clearly. Chandala born from the union of a Brahmin woman and a Shudra man, an act considered taboo. Their existence was defined not by their work, but by their birth, and from there, work followed. It is in texts like these that their exclusion was not just practiced, it was codified. They were to live outside city walls, wear the clothes of the dead, use broken utensils. They could not enter villages after dark. They were assigned symbols, sometimes bells, sometimes marks, so others could identify and avoid them. These codes were written in ink and enforced by belief, by fear of ritual pollution, by a vision of the cosmos where order meant hierarchy and hierarchy meant distance. The Chandala did not ask for this place. It was given to them by the structure of the world. And yet, within that place, they endured. They made something like a life. We often speak of suffering as if it's an external landscape, poverty, exclusion, hunger. But within the Chandala settlements, suffering was also an internal weather, a kind of fog that you had to live with, walk through, work under. And yet beneath that fog, there were also rituals, songs, stories, and secret strength. Let's enter that world, slowly. When night fell across the cremation grounds, when the winds carried whispers and the last embers died out beneath the sky, you might hear something unusual singing. Not devotional hymns from temples, not the court songs of the elite, but simple pulsing chants, rhythmic, sometimes wordless, and often accompanied by hand claps or sticks tapped on logs. The Chandala, despite being barred from temples and scriptural rituals, created their own sacred music songs of grief and survival, songs for ancestors long discarded by the world. Women sang lullabies to children who would never see a school. Men hummed tunes while piling wood or boiling rice. These weren't performances. They were daily companions. In these melodies, there were no gods as distant as the ones in Sanskrit verses. There were spirits, some fierce, some protective, some sorrowful, often linked with nature, trees, rivers, animals, and even the wind. If you listened closely, you'd find stories encoded in the verses. A tale of a mother who walked into fire with her child, not for honor, but for lack of shelter. A song about a dog that followed a Chandala boy for years, becoming his only friend. A folk deity who lives in the woods and only accepts offerings from broken hands. This was their worship, not by the book, but by the blood. Though barred through formal Hindu rituals, Chandalas did not exist in a spiritual vacuum. In fact, their spiritual lives were rich, if largely invisible to outsiders. Their cosmology was often syncretic, shaped by the overlapping influences of folk animism, marginal forms of Shaivism, especially that saw Lord Shiva as a wild, ash-smeared outsider, someone closer to their reality than the polished idols of Vishnu, and in some regions, tantric practices which honored powers that didn't require social purity. Some communities quietly worshipped goddesses like Kali or Chamunda, not as mothers of the world, but as mothers of the unwanted. Blood-drinking, cremation ground-dwelling deities who understood what it meant to live with death daily. Imagine a prayer whispered not inside a temple, but beside a body waiting to burn. Offerings were different too, not ghee or fruits, but perhaps a thread, a piece of bone, a torn piece of cloth tied to a sacred tree. It wasn't a sanctioned religion, it was a lived one. Because the Chandala lived with death, they were sometimes believed to know things others didn't. This too was a curse in disguise. Whispers claimed they could speak to spirits, interpret omens, see dreams that foretold death. Some believed that if a Chandala woman cried at your doorstep, misfortune would follow. Others said Chandala men could smell disease before it showed on the body. None of this was ever proven. But belief doesn't require proof. It feeds on fear, myth, and silence. And so, Chandala communities developed their own ways of protecting themselves. Wearing iron bangles to ward off evil glances, drawing symbols with ash around children, naming babies after things that were unwanted to keep spirits from stealing them, like Bikari or Maran. Ironically, the people who were said to pollute others were considered, in hushed tones, to have some kind of power. Unclean hands, but fingers that might point toward truths others couldn't see. Just because they were excluded from Holi, Diwali, or temple Rath Yatras didn't mean they had no celebrations. On the contrary, they made their own. There were nights when torches would be lit in a clearing and people danced in slow, circling motions. The drums were basic animal skin stretched over clay, but the rhythm pulsed like a heartbeat. Sometimes these festivals aligned with major Hindu ones, but often they marked their own cycles. A death anniversary of a community elder. The first rain after months of dust. The birth of a child who had survived beyond 1 year. Food was shared. Not much just rice, maybe fermented millet, wild greens, but the act of eating together from the same broken vessels became a form of healing. They didn't need permission to rejoice. They did it quietly. But they did it still. If we step outside the settlement for a moment, into the scrolls and minds of those who ruled or preached, we find that the Chandala were not only present, but often anxiously discussed. The Manusmriti painted them as the product of sin, not just a caste, but an error, a byproduct of miscegenation, violation of Varna. But even in the Buddhist and Jain traditions, despite being more inclusive in many ways, Chandalas were still used as metaphors for impurity. Buddha did walk among outcasts and debated Brahmins on the irrelevance of birth, but his followers still saw the Chandala as a marker of society's bottom. It was the poet Thiruvalluvar in Tamil Nadu who subtly questioned these hierarchies, and Kabir, much later, who said, "Ask not of caste, for the breath of all is the same." But such voices were rare. For most of Indian history, to be a Chandala was to be seen and unseen at once named, blamed, but never heard. There are few things more tragic than a child who learns to bow before learning to walk upright. Among the Chandalas, this was often the case. From the moment a child was born, wrapped not in fine cloth, but perhaps in scraps of jute or ash-marked linen, the world began reminding them of what they could not be. Let's walk through that life. The first breath to the first burden. The moment of birth, celebrated in most households with chants and sweets, was different in Chandala homes. There was no priest to read auspicious timings, no family elders to whisper the child's future into their ear. Sometimes, the mother would give birth alone. Other times, only the older women helped those who had seen too much pain to fear it anymore. There were no cries of, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl." With public joy, there was only the quiet question whispered in back alleys or behind cloth partitions. Will this one survive? Infant mortality was high. Malnutrition, exposure, infection all common. But what weighed heavier was the fact that even if the child survived, they were born into a place with no exits. No one came to offer blessings. No upper caste household sent gifts. Sometimes even the stars were not consulted. Because for the world outside, this child's birth wasn't a divine event. It was unfortunate, perhaps even polluting. There were no dolls in silk, no painted wooden animals or polished clay horses. But children play no matter what. A Chandala child might craft a toy out of burnt bones carved into shapes, bits of discarded cloth tied into a crude figure, pebbles arranged into kingdoms only they could see. They'd play in the shadows of funeral pyres. They'd giggle between piles of firewood. Sometimes they'd laugh while chasing goats, until an elder reminded them not to be too loud. Why? Because joy, when it came from the mouths of those who weren't meant to be heard, could offend. Still, they played. Sometimes children would mimic caste life in their games. One would pretend to be the Brahmin. One would play the sweeper. One the guard who doesn't let us in. Even then, caste taught them where to stand. Even in pretend, there were no gurukuls for them. No scrolls, no slates, no syllables of Sanskrit. In fact, even hearing the Vedas being recited aloud was taboo. In many places, if a Chandala was caught listening to a sacred chant, their ears could be filled with molten lead, or they'd be whipped away from the scene. But they weren't ignorant. Knowledge took other forms. Children learned from the earth. They knew how to spot edible herbs and poisonous ones, build a funeral pyre efficiently, read animal tracks and monsoon patterns, listen to the tone of a Brahmin's voice and tell, is this warning or is this threat? Some boys were taught drum rhythms, not as music, but as signals. Some girls learned how to tend wounds or deliver babies, because the city's doctors would never enter their lanes. They spoke languages that weren't written down, dialects laced with metaphors. Their grammar was not in books, it was in bloodlines and breath. Above all, Chandala children were taught one thing: stay down. Look down when walking past strangers. Speak softly. Don't touch the water pot. Don't try to enter the market alone. Don't walk where your shadow might fall on someone else. And never, ever dream of things not meant for you, because dreaming too loudly could get you beaten or worse, noticed. Some children tried. One boy might sneak into the edge of a schoolyard, peering through the fence. One girl might try to follow a group of temple dancers, copying their steps in secret, but someone would always remind them, sometimes with a slap, sometimes with a whisper, "We're not meant for that. Don't make trouble." And over time, the world made them whisper to themselves. But not everyone accepted this fate. There were stories half true, half dream of young Chandalas who fled. A boy who ran away to a distant kingdom, posed as a low-caste porter, and ended up serving in a palace. A girl who disguised herself as a wandering devotee and danced before nobles, earning silver coins and a new name. A group of boys who tried to enter a town's gurukul by pretending to be orphans. Some were caught and humiliated, some were beaten. But just a few vanished into the world, and perhaps found new lives. Inside Chandala settlements, their names were whispered at night, as warnings and as legends. Don't run, they'll kill you. But remember Raghu? He ran. He never came back. Maybe he made it. In the face of locked doors, even the hope of a key becomes a myth worth clinging to. If you ever walk far enough from a temple town, past the sacred groves and city wells, and through the dried-out paths where no torches burn after dusk, you might come across a space that doesn't appear on any map. No shillelagh mentions it, no poet sings of it, and no upper-caste traveler would admit to stepping foot inside it. But it's real, and it pulses with life, ardor, code, and memory. This was the Paragrama, the village beyond the village, the invisible city of the Chandala. Let's walk in, quietly. Chandala settlements weren't planned on royal parchments. No kings sent architects. No tax collectors marked their boundaries. They were built from leftovers of land, of wood, of life. The houses were made of mud bricks that no one wanted, thatched roofs woven with grass from fields denied to them, walls lined with cow dung, not out of reverence, but necessity. Each hut stood as a defiance. You didn't give us space? We took the margins. These settlements often emerged near cremation grounds, rivers, forest edges. And over time, these scattered clusters became something larger, something functional, something alive. No Chandala was allowed in the market square, so they built their own. Women traded herbs, salves, and smoked meat wrapped in banana leaves. Men bartered labor, pottery, bamboo baskets, or bone tools in shadow economies. Some specialized in cleaning animal hides, an unclean job, but necessary for upper-caste leather needs. Others became drummers for distant festivals playing music, but not allowed to stay for the meal. A goat might be traded for a sack of grain. A carved charm exchanged for a bundle of firewood. Coins were rare. Barter was king. But the most valuable currency here? Trust. If someone stole, there was no police to call, no king to report to. So instead, justice was kept among themselves. Chandala settlements couldn't appeal to royal courts. Dharmastras weren't written for them, so they created their own justice systems. Each cluster had a council, usually elders, midwives, and the community drumkeeper. Conflicts like stolen grain, broken promises of marriage, or unapproved contact with outsiders were judged not by books, but by memory and voice. Punishments were rarely violent. More often, exclusion from communal meals, public apology rituals, repayment through service. You see, in a world where you are excluded from everything, your community becomes everything. To lose, that was the worst sentence of all. Despite what outsiders believed, Chandala life was not devoid of art or meaning. In fact, their isolation gave rise to a rich internal culture. Songs were passed from grandmothers to daughters, not of gods, but of fire, famine, and ghost lore. Dances were used to retell the story of a woman who fought off a forest spirit or a man who tricked a landlord. Rituals at new moon nights involved not Sanskrit hymns, but chants in dialects, thick with old pain and coded hope. They created gods of their own forgotten deities, fierce and local. Some were half animal. Some were spirits of the forest. Some were ancestors who never bowed. When they couldn't access temples, they built shrines from bone and red cloth, under neem trees or near rivers that didn't judge them. To survive was an act of rebellion. Every time a Chandala child grew up and learned to shape fire, walk into the woods, or refuse to be ashamed of their name, it was resistance. Some settlements developed signal systems using drums warning each other if outsiders approached, if violence was near. Others helped runaways from upper caste girls fleeing forced marriages to bonded laborers escaping cruel landlords. These settlements were not just homes, they were networks. Whispers carried faster than carts. A message could travel from one cremation ground to another in a matter of hours. And when oppression grew louder, their silence grew sharper. They remembered who hurt them, and they passed that memory on, not in scrolls, but in songs, in lullabies, in warnings, in firelight. Imagine this. You're born into a cage, but this isn't a cage of metal or wood. It's invisible, spiritual, eternal. And worst of all, you're told you built it yourself in a past life. This is the brilliance and the cruelty of how caste was justified. It wasn't just social. It wasn't just economic. It was cosmic. Let's pull apart the machinery piece by chilling peace. In early Vedic texts, the term Varna simply meant color, a metaphor for function, role, or essence. There were four: Brahmins, priests, scholars; Kshatriyas, warriors, rulers; Vaishyas, traders, farmers; Shudras, servants, laborers. But what started as a loose division hardened. And that hardening came not from logic, but from ritual. By the time of the Manusmritya, brutal legal code of caste from 2nd century BC, the roles were no longer roles. They were fates. To violate them wasn't just illegal, it was sinful. The king in ancient India was not just a ruler. He was a guardian of dharma, not truth, but order. And in this system, order meant hierarchy. A king's legitimacy came from performing sacrifices supervised by Brahmins, upholding caste boundaries, funding temples, punishing those who crossed lines. If a Chandala man dared to wear fine clothes or speak Sanskrit, some texts prescribed branding his tongue with hot iron, cutting off his nose, parading him through the city on a donkey, not for crime, but for confusion, for forgetting his place. How do you convince someone to accept their oppression? You tell them? You earned it. According to the karma theory, your birth into a caste wasn't random. It was a reflection of your past life's deeds. Were you born a Brahmin? You must have been virtuous before. Born a Chandala? Clearly, you sinned. This turned oppression into cosmic justice. No one had to whip you. You'd whip yourself spiritually, and any rebellion would only worsen your karma. It was a perfect self-policing system. How do you convince someone to accept their oppression? You tell them, you earned it. According to the karma theory, your birth into a caste wasn't random. It was a reflection of your past life's deeds. Were you born a Brahmin? You must have been virtuous before. Born a Chandala? Clearly, you sinned. This turned oppression into cosmic justice. No one had to whip you. You'd whip yourself spiritually, and any rebellion would only worsen your karma. It was a perfect self-policing system. Texts like the Manusmriti, Dharmashastras, and later Puranas didn't just encode caste, they weaponized it. A few chilling prescriptions. If a Shudra hears a Veda recited, molten lead should be poured in his ears. If he repeats the verses, his tongue should be cut out. A Brahmin who kills a Chandala, small penance. A Chandala who touches a Brahmin's food, entire feast discarded. Justice wasn't equal, because humans weren't considered equal. Even death couldn't escape caste. There were separate cremation grounds, separate funeral rites. Even the afterlife had caste zones. Temples weren't just spiritual centers. They were gates of access. And those gates were barred. Entry was restricted. Rituals were segregated. Sacred food couldn't be touched by lower castes. Even the temple shadows were feared. If it touched a Brahmin, the space had to be purified. But temples didn't just divide people. They trained people to stay divided. A child raised watching his father bow before a priest, but beaten for approaching the temple stairs, learns quickly. God isn't for you. Ritual pollution wasn't metaphorical. It had real consequences. If a Chandala's shadow touched your meal, it was thrown away. If his foot touched a well, it had to be drained. If his wife's sari brushed yours was burned. This wasn't hygiene. It was hatred disguised as holiness. Even smell became a marker. Historical records show Brahmins claiming they could identify a Chandala by scent as if caste were physical. And when physical pollution wasn't enough, they invented mental pollution. Even thinking about a Chandala during prayer was considered a spiritual stain. Ritual pollution wasn't metaphorical. It had real consequences. If a Chandala's shadow touched your meal, it was thrown away. If his foot touched a well, it had to be drained. If his wife's sari brushed yours was burned. This wasn't hygiene. It was hatred disguised as holiness. Even smell became a marker. Historical records show Brahmins claiming they could identify a Chandala by scent as if caste were physical. And when physical pollution wasn't enough, they invented mental pollution. Even thinking about a Chandala during prayer was considered a spiritual stain. Settle in now. Let your breath fall into a gentle rhythm, like the steady sway of wind over old riverbeds. Tonight, we begin with a myth. Not a myth from the epics, with gods and demons and magic arrows. No, not that kind. This is a quieter myth. A modern myth. You might have heard phrases like, everyone knew their dharma, or people accepted their roles. In this version, hierarchy wasn't imposed, it was divine. Caste wasn't oppression, it was cosmic choreography. A divine design where each person belonged where they were born. One that whispers through textbooks and scrolls across chalkboards in dusty classrooms, in the chants of traveling singers, in the burned pages of outlawed books, and in the quiet questions left behind. One that says, India was always peaceful. Everyone accepted their place. there was harmony in hierarchy. But pause. Hold that thought. Let's gently lean closer. In fact, they were barely recorded. One not recorded in palm leaf manuscripts or royal copper plates. One not written by priests or kings. The Chandalas, the Shudras, the Adivasis, they left behind no palaces, no chronicles, no funded temples. Their history wasn't carved into stone. It was murmured, and sometimes screamed, into the void. And what is not recorded often appears as if it never happened. But if you look closer, the Manusmriti obsessively describes punishments for eating with the wrong people, for marrying the wrong caste, for crossing purity lines. Unless people were disobeying, there are entire chapters detailing how to punish those who refuse to follow rules. Because history, when left unguarded, often wraps itself in silence. And silence is not always consent. Sometimes, silence is what you hear after rebellion has been buried. For many centuries, Indian society has been described through a curious lens, one that emphasizes spiritual unity, a cosmic order, and an unbroken civilization. This story is appealing. It feels smooth, orderly, even comforting. But they weren't always silent. Their songs, now nearly lost, spoke of gods who walked with them, not above them. Their rituals, often dismissed as superstition, were sometimes subversions, bold refusals to play by Brahmanical rules. Because they did nothing, but because no one wrote down what they did. But something tugs at its edges. Because when we wander far enough into the margins past the ivory towers and grand, temples, another version of history begins to stir. In Maharashtra, saint poets like Chaukamela wrote verses that spoke of pain, of exclusion, and of divine love that ignored caste. But for centuries, they were excluded from formal temple traditions. Instead, it lives in the dust of forgotten villages. If caste was just accepted, why are there so many stories of those who refused? The gods, disturbed, demand that he be sent back. The story ends with him fading, but not vanishing. That ghost of rebellion lingers, quiet but unsettling. It's a strange fact of history that peace is easier to remember than pain. Or rather, that peace can be constructed from the ashes of pain. Unlike revolutions in the West, which were often romanticized, like the French storming Bastille, or the Americans defying tea taxes, India's revolts from below were rarely celebrated. Why? Because those who kept the records, the priests, scholars, ministers, were rarely from the oppressed classes. That's the first clue to uncovering the myth. Absence is not proof of peace. If we listen carefully to ancient texts themselves, yes, the very ones that appear to support caste hierarchies, we begin to notice an undercurrent of anxiety. Take the Manusmriti, for instance, often cited as the legal backbone of caste society. Now, ask yourself, why would such detailed punishments be needed? Why list how to punish intercaste marriages unless they were happening? Why describe how to deal with Chandalas who wear the clothes of higher castes unless some dared to do so? The very rules, so often cited as proof of order, are in fact evidence of resistance. The Chandalas, the outcasts tasked with burning the dead, are often portrayed as passive, broken figures. And when Buddhist monks traveled through India during Ashoka's time, they recorded stories of entire villages of untouchables who refused Vedic rituals, who lived on the edges but kept their own gods, their own rules, their own dignity. Even the Mahabharata, India's great epic, has a haunting passage where a Chandala, named Matanga, ascends to the heavens, defying caste expectations. Historians often refer to a term, subaltern silence, when those at the bottom of the social pyramid are written out of history. We see this across time. In Tamil Nadu, folk songs speak of a king who gave land to the landless, later called a heretic by temple priests. In Maharashtra, saint poets like Chockamela wrote verses that spoke of pain, of exclusion, and of divine love that ignored caste. But for centuries, they were excluded from formal temple traditions. Basavana, their prophet poet, was later sanitized and selectively remembered, as if history had run a gentle hand over the rebellion's cheek and said, "Hush now, that's not the version we want to tell." But did anyone ever mention the Kalabra dynasty, who overthrew caste kings in South India for over 2 centuries? In Karnataka, the Veerashaivis, a radical movement that rejected caste, gender roles, and Brahmanical supremacy, saw its leaders persecuted. And in every one of these cases, the story was later edited, not erased entirely, but trimmed, softened, pacified. They challenged the idea that caste was ancient, eternal, and unopposed. They remind us that hierarchy had to be enforced, not embraced, and silence is often imposed. Perhaps you learned about the French Revolution in school, or the Quit India movement, or Shivaji's guerrilla warfare. Probably not, because the real reason we don't remember these revolts is not just because they were small, it's because they were inconvenient. And that is the heart of the myth we're unraveling tonight. The next time someone tells you that Indian history is one of peaceful acceptance, of divine order and social harmony, remember this: harmony can be manufactured. But if you listen quietly enough, under the surface of that silence, you'll hear another sound, one softer than revolt, yet louder than obedience. A heartbeat, a song, a question, and the wind moving through ancient ashes where fire once dared to burn upwards, not just down. Close your eyes if you wish. Picture a dim forest clearing at dusk. The cicadas are murmuring. A fire crackles faintly in the center. Around it sit figures not found in history books, barefoot, scarred, draped in homespun cloth. They do not speak loudly, but their eyes hold memory. Memory of battles unremembered and victories uncelebrated. We are here to listen. Long before the terms uprising, protest, or civil disobedience entered political vocabulary, there were gestures. A pot of sacred water refused. A road blocked by barefoot farmers. A drumbeat that declared, "We do not bow." These were not always armed revolts. Often they were social earthquakes. Quiet, subtle, and slow, but no less powerful. The story of caste in India is not just the story of Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and kings. It is also the story of those who said no, and tonight we listen to them. Let's begin with a dynasty almost scrubbed from Indian history, the Kalabras. Between the 3rd and 6th century CE, they swept across Tamil Nadu, overthrowing caste-aligned monarchies and challenging Brahmanical orthodoxy. For nearly 300 years, they ruled, promoting Buddhism, Jainism, and local non-Brahmanical traditions. So why aren't they in your textbooks? Because they left few monuments, and more importantly, because the Hindu kings that came after them waged not just political wars, but wars of memory. Texts written during the Pallava and Chola periods describe the Kalabras as evil usurpers, or simply refer to their rule as a dark age. No temples built, no Vedas chanted, a time when the social pyramid was flipped, and so it was blacked out. But the darkness wasn't a void. It was a veil behind which the lower castes and marginalized faiths briefly found space to breathe. Sometimes rebellion wasn't in swords, it was in stories. Take the Mahabharata's tragic character, Ekalavya, the tribal boy who trains in archery by building a statue of his guru Dronacharya. He excels. And what happens? Drona, fearing that his favorite pupil Arjuna might be outshone, demands that Ekalavya cut off his thumb as Guru Dakshina. The tale is often taught as a lesson in obedience. But beneath that layer lies an undercurrent of resistance. Think about it. Ekalavya taught himself without approval, without a place in the elite school. And still, he became the best. His act of creating his own teacher out of clay and willpower is rebellion, even if crushed. And in Dalit literature today, Ekalavya isn't a victim. He's a symbol of denied genius, of those who train in the forest, rise quietly, and are punished for their brilliance. His severed thumb is India's earliest metaphor for institutional exclusion. As centuries passed, the language of resistance became poetry. The Bhakti saints from the 6th to 17th centuries seem peaceful on the surface, but dig deeper, and you'll find fire wrapped in silk. These were poets and singers, often from lower castes, who bypassed Brahmins and temples entirely, speaking directly to God. Chakamila, a Dalit saint from Maharashtra, was denied entry to the Vithal temple in Pandharpur, but composed hundreds of abhangas that shamed society and claimed equality through devotion. Kabir, born to a family of weavers in Varanasi, wrote verses that mocked both Hindu and Muslim rituals, calling out hypocrisy and caste arrogance. His famous couplet, Jadi na pacho sadhu ki, pach liji gyan. Ravidas, a leatherworker by caste, declared in song, Vigumpura Shara Kanam, Duke and Dohu Nai Thieth. These weren't just hymns, they were manifestos, and they spread far through song, through wandering, through memory. Because paper could be burned, but melodies linger in mouths. Beyond the plains of caste society lived the Adivasi's tribal communities, often excluded from the fourfold Varna system altogether. But don't mistake exclusion for silence. The forests of India have seen countless micro-resistances. The Coal Rebellion in Chota Nagpur, led by tribal leaders against land seizure and caste-based revenue policies. The Santhal Uprising in 1855, where nearly 60,000 Santhals declared their own governance against exploitative landlords and moneylenders. The Bhils, Gonds, and Orahans all have long oral traditions of resisting caste outsiders who attempted to tax, convert, or displace them. Their stories weren't always called history, but they are passed from grandmother to child, from drumbeat to dance. And in that transfer, rebellion becomes culture. In many of these early revolts, religion wasn't just a tool of oppression, it was also used to fight back. The Veerashaiva Lingayat movement in 12th century Karnataka, led by Basavana, openly rejected Brahminical rituals, idol worship, and caste hierarchy. They believed in personal divinity, work dignity, and spiritual equality. Their Vakyanas mocked priesthood and purity. The rich will make temples for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, my body the shrine, my head the cupola of gold. It was defiance wrapped in devotion, and for that, many of them were persecuted. But their verses survived, and their movement still alive today remains a whisper of that revolt. So why are we telling these stories in a sleepy voice? Because sometimes you need softness to unearth what loudness buried. Because behind every temple wall is a brick laid by hands that weren't allowed inside. Because in every epic, there's a character left unnamed but not unimportant. And because the true history of India is not just one of glorious empires, but of every soul who stood up, even in chains, and said, "I am more than my place." Let your breath slow again. Let the images fade, not because they are untrue, but because they are heavy, and sleep asks for lightness. But now you know, in your own quiet way, that the oppressed have never truly been silent, only silenced. There's something eerie about ancient soil. Beneath the modern world lie ruins, some majestic, some mundane, but some whisper secrets no textbook dares to repeat. Not about kings and wars, but about kitchens, skeletons, broken beads, and charred rice husks. The everyday lives of those history tried to erase. Let's listen to the bones tonight. Let's start at the edge of known history, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dhalavira. Before the Vedas, before the caste system as we know it, the Indus Valley civilization was vast, planned, and incredibly sophisticated. Grid-like cities, underground drainage, multi-story buildings, standardized weights. But here's what's not found. No grand temples. No clear signs of kings or priestly elites. No palaces. No war monuments. Instead, archaeologists found uniformity. Houses of different sizes, yes, but not wildly unequal. Public infrastructure accessible to all. Shared wells. Wide streets. A civilization that, some argue, may have been more egalitarian than those that followed. And some Dalit scholars have asked, what if the Indus people were the first to resist the idea of hierarchy? Could this be a civilization before caste? It's a chilling thought, because what happened next may have buried that world forever. In the late 1920s, when the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro were unearthed, archaeologists found skeletons lying in the streets, face down, side by side. Some had fractured skulls. At first, this was interpreted as signs of violent invasion. But recent studies challenged that. No mass graves, no large-scale burning, no definitive evidence of war. So what happened? Could it have been disease? Or social collapse? Or perhaps internal revolt? We may never know. But what we do know is this: the people vanished. And not long after, Vedic culture began to rise in the Gangetic plains with a rigid social order. Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras. It makes you wonder, was this new order built on the ashes of something older and maybe fairer? The Aryan migration invasion theory is one of the most controversial ideas in South Asian history. It posits that Indo-Aryan speaking people migrated into India around 1500 BCE, bringing with them Vedic rituals, Sanskrit, fire altars, and caste. Proponents say this explains the cultural shift from Harappan egalitarianism to Vedic hierarchy. Critics argue no concrete evidence of a violent invasion exists. Cultural mixing may have been more gradual. A conquest not just of land, but of memory. And archaeology for him was a tool to recover the stolen past. He wrote, but Dalit scholars like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had their own take. If the Shudras were Aryans, they would not have been treated as untouchables. DNA evidence from skeletons here suggests they were not genetically identical to Indo-Aryans. Instead, they match with modern Dravidian and Adivasi populations. To Ambedkar, caste was not a natural division, it was a political act. Now listen closely. These findings rarely make the news, but they matter. Rakhigarhi, one of the largest Harappan sites. Kizadi. Excavations since 2015 have uncovered a 5th century BCE urban settlement with advanced infrastructure, graffiti in Tamil Brahmi script, and signs of literary culture outside the Sanskrit world. What if the South had its own pre-Aryan intellectual tradition, erased from the northern textbook narrative? Inam Gaon, Payam Pale, and Chandra Kadagar, sites with burial practices, tools and pottery that don't align with Vedic customs suggesting parallel civilizations existed. So what does this mean? It means caste didn't fall from the sky. It was constructed slowly, painfully, and sometimes violently. And it was not accepted by all. Imagine for a moment a land without names, without stories carved in stone, and without temples crowned by spires. A land not of kings, but of planners and potters. Not of poets, but of bricklayers and bead makers. This was Kalibangan. Long before the Ganges carried hymns and kingdoms, long before Ashoka's pillars and Akbar's courts, Kalibangan stood quietly on the banks of the Gagar-Hakra River, known in later whispers as the dry, vanished Sarasvati. Today, the wind moves over its broken foundations with no resistance. It rustles through half-buried mud bricks, lifting grains of sand that once pressed against human hands. There is no gold here, no marble, no towering obelisks. And yet, there is something else, something more ancient, more strange, and in some ways, more unsettling. Because Kalibangan died not with war, nor conquest, nor famine, but with an eerie, deliberate stillness. What remains is not a battlefield, but a question. The name Kalibangan means black bangles in modern Hindi, an echo of the charred pottery and jewelry fragments often found in the soil. Yet its true name, if it had one, is lost to time. What we know is what the earth tells us. Beneath the ground, archaeologists found streets in neat right angles, wells that still catch rain, and fire altars burnt, blackened, abruptly extinguished. Altars arranged not like crude hearths, but with deliberate geometry, squares within squares, symmetry and silence. No bones, no blood, just emptiness. Let your thoughts drift to a different kind of history, not of emperors and dates, but of footprints and ashes. Kalibangan does not speak in words. It murmurs through carbon stains and pottery shards. Its story is written in soil that has not shifted for 4,000 years. We begin our descent, not into a tomb, but into a vanished city where the fire went out and never came back. The sky, still a gentle shade of iron gray, hangs heavy over flat rooftops made of packed mud. The desert wind has not yet risen. All is still. A low murmur travels through narrow lanes as people emerge from their homes, carefully built rows of houses, each a single story, each facing the street. There are no random bends here, no spirals, just lines, precision. A city laid out as if someone had planned it not for grandeur, but for balance. Kalibangan was one of the earliest examples of city planning in human history. Long before Rome built its aqueducts, before Athens rose on the Acropolis, here stood a town divided into two halves, a citadel to the west and a lower town to the east, each with its own grid, each with its own rhythms. The citadel, raised on a mound, wasn't a fortress in the traditional sense. There were no weapons found, no garrisons. Instead, it held something else: structures of baked brick, elevated platforms, strange oblong pits with ash and charcoal. Fire altars, rows of them, lined up neatly, as if tending the sacred flame wasn't just a ritual, but a civic responsibility. And the lower town? That was the beating heart of daily life. Every house had access to a well, and every well was lined and planned. There were private baths, stone-lined drains, and open courtyards. There was no palace, no temple, no obvious center of power, just a quiet sense of order, as though the city itself, not a ruler, held authority. The people of Kalibangan were not unknown to craft or commerce. Pottery was everywhere smooth, well-fired, often painted with delicate black designs. Geometric lines, peacocks, pipal leaves. These were not idle decorations. They echoed across hundreds of miles, found also in distant cities of the Indus world Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Lawful. Kalibangan was part of something larger, a civilization that spoke not through empires, but through trade, design, and ritual. And among these was the fire. Fire altars in Kalibangan were unique. They were not haphazard hearths for cooking, nor massive pyres for cremation. They were clean, deliberate. Square or rectangular brick platforms, some with internal divisions, aligned with uncanny consistency, often arranged in rows, ash residue within. No idols found, no bones, just the remains of controlled flame. Some archaeologists believe these were used for domestic rituals, perhaps early forms of yanas, fire offerings described in much later Vedic texts. Others argue they predate such texts entirely, belonging to an older spiritual language we no longer speak. But what's undeniable is this: the fires were sacred, and then they were gone. Just like that, one day, they stopped burning. No evidence of destruction, no invasion, no fire from without, just ... cessation. Why? In the heat-hushed silence of northwest India today, if you stand on the mounds of Kalibangan and look to the north, you'll see nothing but dry plains stretching into the haze. A few scattered trees, the occasional shepherd's call. The air itself seems to shimmer, as though still holding on to the memory of flowing water. But long ago, a mighty river ran here. The Sarasvati, they called it, or perhaps the Gagar-Hakra, depending on which scholar you ask. To the people of Kalibangan, it was lifeblood, a wide, unpredictable river that swelled during the monsoons, then receded, leaving rich silt behind. Along its banks rose cities, not just Kalibangan, but dozens more: Banawali, Rakhigarhi, Kunal, an entire unseen corridor of civilization, hidden under what are now farmlands and sands. This river was no minor tributary. It rivaled the Indus itself, and for Kalibangan, it was the reason the city existed. But rivers, like empires, are not eternal. Gradually, sometime around 1900 BCE, the river began to change. Climate patterns shifted. The monsoons grew weaker. The river's flow, once wild and abundant, turned timid. It split into seasonal rivulets. Then one day, it failed altogether. To the people of Kalibangan, it would have seemed slow at first. Wells took longer to fill. Fields were dry more often than not. The clay cracked faster under the sun. Perhaps they told themselves it would return, that the gods were merely sleeping. But rivers do not return from extinction, and without its river, Kalibangan became a skeleton city. We find signs of abandonment, not in chaos, but in silence. Streets once swept clean are covered in dust. The last layers of pottery are simpler, cruder. Fire altars are left untouched, never desecrated, just unused. Tools are left where they were. There's no sign of violence, no mass graves, no sudden trauma. Just emptiness, a careful, deliberate departure. As though the people understood something profound, that when the sacred flame of the river died, so too must the city that depended on it. Archaeologists describe it as planned desertion. It's a strange phrase, one rarely used. But here, it fits. Kalibangan wasn't destroyed. It was mourned and left behind. Later Vedic texts would speak of the Sarasvati as a divine river, lost due to the sins of men or the age of Kali. They would remember her as a goddess who once flowed with purity and then disappeared beneath the sands. And perhaps, in some echo of ancestral memory, those texts held onto the ghost of Kalibangan, its fire altars, its brick wells, its broken pottery glinting under the desert sun. At the center of Kalibangan's mystery lie the fire altars, silent now and cracked by time, but once burning bright. Unlike most Harappan cities, where ritual architecture is hard to identify, Kalibangan offers something unusual: rows of mud brick platforms with clear, deliberate arrangements. These are not hearths for cooking. They are too precise, too aligned. Some are square, others oval or circular. Many show signs of repeated burning thin layers of fine ash, reddish soil where flames once kissed the earth. In a few, bones were found. Not human, but animal, mostly cattle or goat. These were not places of cremation, but of offering. The altars often lie within enclosed courtyards, walled off from the main settlement, yet still within reach of everyday life. As if the sacred was close, but not too close. Fires here were likely tended with care, fed with wood, ghee, perhaps even seeds or herbs. Ritual specialists, maybe elders or priests, would have performed simple, but solemn acts, lighting the flame, uttering chants, presenting offerings to forces they could not see, but surely felt. These altars are some of the oldest known examples of fire ritual in the Indian subcontinent. They predate the formal Vedic sacrifices by many centuries, and yet the echoes are unmistakable. The shape of the altars, the presence of ash and offerings, the reverence for fire as a medium between humans and the divine. What's even more striking is the abruptness with which these rituals ceased. In one layer of excavation, the altars are freshly built, recently used. The ash is soft, black, untouched. In the very next, they are buried, forgotten, overgrown with debris. There is no evidence of desecration, no signs of forced suppression or cultural rupture, just abandonment. It is as though the people no longer saw value in lighting the flames. Perhaps the failing river, the drying wells, and the thinning crops made them feel unheard. Perhaps the gods had gone silent. Or perhaps their world no longer needed fire in that form. For archaeologists, this silent ending poses more questions than answers. Why fire? Why here? Why then? Some scholars see in these altars a proto-Vedic tradition, a precursor to the elaborate yajnas of later Brahmanical culture. Others believe they reflect a completely different belief system, one that worshipped local spirits or elemental forces, now lost to time. But what we do know is this. For a brief moment in ancient India, before temples rose, before mantras were written, before priests claimed monopoly over the sacred simple flames burned in the mud brick courtyards of Kalibangan, not to destroy, but to connect, to remember, to revere. And then they went out. Imagine a silent stretch of desert along the dry bed of the Gaga River. Winds whisper through the dust, and the land seems barren, empty, unremarkable. But beneath that dry crust of earth, something ancient was sleeping. In the early 20th century, whispers of buried bricks and pottery began to surface in this quiet region of northern Rajasthan. Local villagers, digging wells or tending to fields, occasionally uncovered strange, symmetrical shards too uniform, too finely made to be dismissed. British surveyors first noted the peculiar mound in passing, but it wasn't until the 1950s that the Archaeological Survey of India, under the guidance of Dr. B. Lal, turned serious attention to the site. What followed was one of the most meticulous excavations in Indian archaeological history. Layer by layer, year by year, the dust peeled back to reveal the bones of a city. Streets reappeared, altars emerged, warehouses, wells, staircases, drains, tiny toys and burnished beads, the careful remains of a vanished civilization. The city was named after a nearby village, Kalibangan, meaning Black Bangles, a name that lingered long after the people had gone. But more than objects or walls, it was patterns that the archaeologists noticed. The precision of the layout, the measured proportions, the grid of streets intersecting at right angles. Even the spacing between homes seemed intentional. This was not accidental sprawl. This was conscious planning, urban design, several millennia before the word even existed. What puzzled scholars most was not just what was present, but what was missing. No grand palaces, no monumental temples, no royal inscriptions. Who ruled here? Where are their names? Their proclamations? Their victories and conquests? Kalibangan, like most Indus Valley cities, seems almost anonymously well managed. Its glory was in order, not opulence. In drainage, not dominance. But the deeper they dug, the stranger the questions became. Why was this city abandoned so carefully? In most ancient ruins, one sees signs of catastrophe. Buildings collapsed, corpses buried under rubble, weapons still clutched. But Kalibangan showed signs of peaceful departure. Pots were still upright. Tools lay neatly where they were last used. Doorways stood intact. It's as though the people simply walked away. And beneath that silence, the fire altars slumbered untouched for thousands of years. The excavation revealed not just a vanished city, but a pattern of civilization, of how humans once lived in coordination with rivers, seasons, and each other. It told a story not of empires, but of settlements, not of kings, but of daily lives. Even the bricks spoke a peculiar blend of ratios and uniformity. Some made from kill-fired clay, others sun-dried mud. Their sizes matched those found in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. This hinted at shared standards, perhaps shared governance, or at least shared ideas passed over great distances. In many ways, Kalibangan expanded the definition of the Indus Valley civilization. It wasn't just about cities near the Indus River. Kalibangan pushed the boundary eastward, tying together the Ghaggar-Hakra basin into the greater web of urban life that spanned from Baluchistan to Gujarat. But for all it revealed, Kalibangan kept its deepest secrets intact. Why the altars were extinguished, why the river changed course, why a thriving city simply decided to go quiet. Today, the ruins lie fenced and protected. Archaeological boards mark the structures. Dust covers the altars again, though gently now, almost like a blanket. Visitors arrive sometimes, often in silence, their footsteps soft against the ancient soil. Few cities whisper as quietly as Kalibangan. Fewer still are heard. Picture the last fire dying out on the altar. There's no panic in the air, no invading army at the gates, just quiet, deliberate stillness. A priest steps away from the flame, leaving behind a few charred bones, some ash, a broken pot. Then he turns, walks down the wide, dusty avenue, and disappears into history. That is how Kalibangan ends. But its story, its legacy, still burns softly in the questions it raised. Because Kalibangan isn't just a forgotten city. It's a mirror reflecting a version of human civilization that prioritized rhythm over glory, systems over conquest, and memory over monument. It tells us that urbanization isn't always noisy or grand. Sometimes the most advanced cities are the quietest. This was a place that thrived without temples dominating the skyline, where gods may have been worshipped in humble courtyards, where altars sat under open skies, where religion didn't necessarily mean hierarchy, but perhaps something more personal, something elemental. Fire, for instance, wasn't just ritual, it was communication, a whisper to the heavens, a ritual of transformation. A torch passed from generation to generation until it wasn't, because one day the fire went out. Not in rage, but in retreat. The people moved on. The city folded in on itself. And that silence, that deliberate, haunting silence, became Kalibangan's most powerful relic. You can hold a pot in your hand. You can measure a wall. But how do you touch silence? How do you interpret a choice to leave? Historians and archaeologists have wrestled with this question for decades. Some argue that drought slowly choked the region, driving the Gaga River into obscurity. Others point to tectonic shifts or gradual trade collapses. Still others believe that a deeper cultural transformation, perhaps even philosophical, led the Indus people to abandon their urban lives and move toward village-based settlements. But none of these theories quite explain why the altars stopped burning, why ritual ended, why sacred space was left behind. Unless the people of Kalibangan weren't fleeing a disaster, but letting go of a cycle. A civilization can choose silence. It can choose stillness. It can dissolve not in flames, but in wisdom. Kalibangan may have done exactly that, and that's why its legacy still matters. Because in a world obsessed with expansion, with noise, with permanence, Kalibangan whispers the opposite. It teaches that sometimes the most powerful thing a civilization can do is pause. Imagine yourself not on a battlefield, not in a bustling market or a shadowy alley, but inside a palace, quiet and radiant, where the walls are cool to the touch and echo only the soft rustle of silk. This is not the emperor's court. This is the harem. A world within a world, hidden behind carved yali screens and towering archways. A place both golden and ghostly. You are a woman born into privilege, perhaps a nobleman's daughter or a foreign bride, chosen for beauty, talent, or alliance. At a young age, you are brought here, ushered through opulent gates that shut gently behind you with finality. From that moment onward, your world becomes very small, but it is not barren. Here, there is splendor. Ivory combs on sandalwood tables, rose oil stored in silver vials, courtyards lined with fountains that mimic the sound of distant rainfall, caged birds with silken feathers, poetry inked in gold, and women, hundreds of women each adorned, educated, and exquisitely alone. You sleep on embroidered sheets and awaken to the song of a tanpura. You spend mornings learning calligraphy or listening to Persian ghazals recited by other ladies-in-waiting. You walk slow circles in marble corridors, trailing your fingers across carved walls. Time moves differently here, like oil poured in water-heavy, gliding, resisting urgency. And yet beneath all this beauty, beneath the rose-tinted lamps and henna-stained hands, lurks a hollow ache. Because this palace is a gilded cage, and its bars are not iron but ritual, silence, and expectation. You may never again walk in a street unchaperoned. You may never look upon the horizon without a screen between you and the sun. And most of all, you may never speak to the emperor. Behind the soft curtains and the muted music, there is a quiet order, an invisible architecture that governs everything within the harem. It is not chaos. It is deeply structured. And within that structure lies not just routine but power. The Mughal harem was vast. At its peak, it may have housed hundreds, sometimes even thousands of women. Yet not all were wives. Not all were concubines. And not all were waiting for the emperor's call. Instead, each woman had a role. There were queens, begums, women of noble birth or political importance. Their chambers were the grandest, often located in the innermost sanctum of the zenana, closest to the emperor's own quarters. These women could influence royal decisions, commission architecture, support scholars, and even manage imperial funds. Some were known to govern regions as regents or hold diplomatic correspondence. Then came the concubines, not necessarily lower in beauty or refinement, but often without noble lineage. Some rose through the ranks, earning affection and influence. Others remained whispers in history, their names lost like perfume on the wind. There were also maidservants, some brought as gifts, others recruited from noble households. Many were educated. Some were skilled musicians, others expert in embroidery, dance, herbal medicine, or astrology. They were the lifeblood of the harem, keeping its silence running like clockwork. Then there were the eunuchs' trusted intermediaries, who acted as the voice of the women in the outside world. They carried letters, gifts, and sometimes even commands from the harem to the emperor or his court. Some became immensely powerful, known by name, feared and respected alike. And amidst all of this were the children daughters of noble women, sons of the emperor, wards from other royal families, all raised behind the same carved screens. For them, this was the only world they knew. For many girls, it would also be the last world they would ever live in. Each day was shaped by unspoken rules, where one could walk, who one could speak to, how often one could approach the inner court, and who received what privileges. Favor was a currency here. A glance from the emperor could shift the tides of power. A whispered poem, overheard by the right ear, could open doors or close them forever. Jealousy did not speak aloud. It lingered in silences. Rivalry was laced in compliments, smiles that curved at the corners, and through it all, there was decorum. Grace, always, even in ambition. You had to learn to speak in suggestion, to compete without confrontation, to survive in stillness. No battles were fought in the harem, yet victories were won every day through poetry, prayer, patience, and perfume. The harem was not just a space of seclusion, it was also a sanctuary of the senses. Imagine, if you will, the hour before dusk. The marble floors are cool beneath bare feet. The shadows stretch long across corridors, scented with sandalwood and rose oil. Oil lamps are being lit one by one, casting a soft, golden flicker across the painted ceilings. It is time for poetry. In the Mughal world, poetry was not merely entertainment. It was a lifeline, a form of expression, an offering, and at times, the only way to speak one's truth. Many women of the harem were highly educated. They learned to read and write in Persian, the language of courtly culture, and Arabic, the language of religion and scholarship. Some even mastered Sanskrit, Turkic, or Braj Bhasha, depending on their ancestry or the preferences of their tutors. They wrote verses in secret notebooks. They recited ghazals to one another in shaded courtyards. They composed riddles and exchanged them with subtle wit. Sometimes a poem would be embroidered into silk, its meaning hidden within patterns known only to the reader. Some of these women were patrons in the true sense commissioning works of art, music, and literature. Nur Jahan, the powerful wife of Emperor Jahangir, famously held court in her own right and supported painters, calligraphers, and architects. Shahanara Begum, daughter of Shah Jahan, was not only a patron of Sufi poetry and literature, but also a mystic writer herself. But even women without royal blood often formed literary salons within the harem. There, they shared ideas, read out loud from manuscripts, and discussed stories from the epics and romances, Layla Majnun, Shirin Farhad, or Yusuf Zulaikha tales of love, longing, and impossible choices. The arts filled the silences. Music was taught in the quieter wings of the harem, especially stringed instruments like the sitar, tanpura, and rudravina, their melodies soft enough not to travel beyond the inner walls. Dancers practiced forms of Kathak, their ankles adorned with bells that jingled like distant wind chimes. Miniature painting, too, found a place here, with some women learning to paint delicate flowers or working with gold leaf borders and calligraphic designs. Perfume was an art form of its own. The Adaruma chamber, filled with small bottles of oils and dried petals, was where women crafted their own unique scents. Rose, vetiver, musk, saffron, and jasmine were crushed, steeped, and left to age in sandalwood oil. Some fragrances were warm and spicy, others soft and floral. Every woman had her own signature scent, just as personal as her poetry. And then there was the embroidery. Days and nights were often spent weaving meaning into cloth zardozi with gold thread, chikankari with whisper-fine needlework. The garments that emerged were not just clothing, but quiet diaries filled with symbols, metaphors, and sometimes coded feelings. In the absence of free movement, the inner world deepened. A folded fan might carry a poem. A painted tile could bear a hidden motif. A small bird in a gilded cage might represent something far more personal. The harem was a world of signs, where silence spoke, and beauty was resistance. Let's begin with the grand myth that every woman in the Mughal harem lived in the soft focus of luxury, awaiting the emperor's love. That silks, jewels, and scented baths made up for the absence of freedom. That one day, perhaps, he would choose you. But the truth, as it often is in history, is lonelier and more layered. The Mughal emperor had hundreds, sometimes thousands of women in his harem. These weren't only wives or concubines, but also female relatives, attendants, musicians, poets, and slaves. For many of them, he was not a man, but a myth distant, godlike, wrapped in ceremony, and guarded by power. Some never met him. Some met him once. A rare few saw him often. And even for those chosen as companions, their influence was never guaranteed. The emperor's favor was unpredictable. shaped as much by palace intrigue and whispers as by beauty or intelligence. One wrong look, one wrong word, and the doors could close forever. The harem was a fortress within a fortress, surrounded by high stone walls, with yali windows allowing women to look out but never be seen. It was both sanctuary and prison. The architecture was designed for separation. Even the corridors were narrow and winding, discouraging direct lines of vision or escape. Women were watched constantly, not just by guards, but by each other. Rivalries brewed in silence. Every gift from the emperor sparked envy. Every whisper could be interpreted as sedition. There was no privacy, no open space to breathe freely. No friend could truly be trusted. And yet, it was in this pressure-cooked atmosphere that women formed quiet bonds, secret loyalties, coded friendships, and sisterhoods of silence. Some women found solace in spirituality, fasting, praying, or writing devotional verses. Others went numb, filling their days with embroidery, bathing rituals, or feeding birds in the courtyard. A few broke entirely consumed by boredom, jealousy, or unfulfilled love. When the emperor did visit a woman's quarters, it was never casual. It came with protocol. The chamber was cleaned to perfection. Silk cushions were fluffed. The perfume burner was lit hours in advance, so the room smelled like roses and amber. Dishes were prepared, music rehearsed, jewels arranged. She would wait, and sometimes he wouldn't come. At other times, the visit was brief, politely affectionate, perhaps even joyful, but it rarely resembled the epics of love sung in the ghazals these women recited to each other by candlelight. He might be warm today, cold tomorrow. Your poem might move him once and be forgotten by the next festival. Your beauty might make him linger or bore him by morning. There were women who spent years hoping for a return visit. There were women who bore his children and still felt invisible. There were women who died without ever leaving the wing they'd been assigned to. The romantic relationships within the harem were often less about love, more about power. Gaining the emperor's favor could mean influence, not just personal privilege, but political sway. A favored queen might secure roles for her brothers, land for her family, or control over key appointments. That meant every woman was both a rival and a pawn. Whispers could ruin reputations. Rumors of disloyalty or arrogance could lead to exile, even death. A single slip in courtly etiquette could undo years of patient waiting. To be noticed by the emperor was not always a blessing. It often meant stepping into a dangerous spotlight where every action was judged, every glance interpreted, every rival watching. Most women in the harem were brought in, young some as brides in political alliances, others as war captives, and many more sold into the court by families hoping for favor. They didn't choose the marble walls. They were placed behind them. As years passed, their dreams changed. Some stopped waiting for love and focused on securing a future for their children, maneuvering for better tutors, richer gifts, or promised marriages. Some turned to books, scriptures, and philosophical texts, trying to understand suffering as divine design. A few resisted in subtle ways, refusing to bathe when summoned, feigning illness, or creating private languages to mock their guards. One legend even tells of a woman who released all her caged birds on the day the emperor died, calling it a final funeral song for all their trapped hearts. And yet, despite all the politics, the perfume, the poetry, and the loneliness, there was something deeply human at the heart of it all. These women laughed, cried, bled, birthed, wrote, and aged in silence. They created beauty while enduring invisibility. They waited behind marble for a man who would never see them fully, not as artists, thinkers, or individuals, but as shadows to be arranged, voices to be muted, and silk-draped tokens of empire. Their words are mostly lost. Their faces remain unknown. But in the quiet echo of their chambers, in fading ink and cracked tile, we can still hear them breathe. And that's the final haunting gift of history. It reminds us that even in luxury, even in palaces, even among queens, it is possible to be utterly alone. In dust we walked, in silk we slept, in cities planned and altars kept. We built with bricks and worshipped fire. We watched the rivers shrink and tire. We sang for kings who never heard. We wrote in verse, each line unheard. In latticed walls our thoughts took flight, perfumed with longing, lost to night. The streets of Mohenjo hold their breath, where floods and silence dance with death. And in the harem's veiled design, time folded hearts like prayer and spine. So close your eyes and walk these roads, past ivory thrones and secret codes, past burnished walls, past broken tiles, past phantom queens and vanished smiles. History does not shout, it hums. It lives where no applause ever comes. In every sleep, a whisper stays, the lives we lost in palace haze. Breathe deep the dust, let silence keep, for boring history sings best when you're asleep.